Hey there, and welcome to my August training video. I decided to do my CU portfolio this year as a series of video essays. So I thought it would be a fun way to mix things up, hopefully make the content a little more engaging by bringing the presentations that I went to into the video and engaging with them in that format, and hopefully maybe including some fun other little digital tricks. And maybe I can also show off a couple of the technical skills I've been cultivating at the School of Journalism the past few years. So, without further ado, let's cue the little introduction. So that was just a short montage of some of the Instagram shenanigans I got up to with me and my co. So hopefully you enjoyed that. For the purposes of this video, obviously a lot happened during August training, some of which was stuff that I covered in my first year of training. But I've decided to pick out the three most impactful trainings from August and kind of focus in on those in more of an in-depth way, just because I don't want this to be like an hour-long documentary. So jumping into the first training session I want to talk about was the sexual violence training. And I really enjoyed it because Bailey Reed from Equity Services came and gave a really fantastic presentation on sexual violence. I learned a lot, and hopefully I have some more tools to help anyone deal with that should that come across during my job or at any other point in my life. So the first big takeaway that I thought was important was that she helped define sexual violence. So she started by expressing that it was multifaceted.
When I talk about sexual violence at Carleton, I am talking about a continuum of behavior and expression. So often when people talk about sexual violence, we tend to think about it as just physical sexual assault. That is certainly one piece of it, but there are also things that are like attitudes and beliefs, right? Where we're thinking about having those sort of misogynistic attitudes, transphobic or homophobic attitudes. And these attitudes and beliefs often first are expressed verbally.
So to summarize that clip, I think it's important to kind of get past the myth that sexual violence is necessarily an assault or necessarily, a physical manifestation. It can definitely look like attitudes. It can definitely look like certain types of language, misogynistic language. She used the example later on in the presentation of calling like an undershirt a wife beater. Like stuff like that is definitely a form of sexual violence, even if it is not as overt as physical manifestations. So that's an important thing to consider. And not limit your scope of what you might perceive as sexual violence. The second thing that I thought was important in defining sexual violence was that it is not society that gets to decide that, it is the victim that gets to decide when they have had a boundary that has been crossed in some kind of way.
So for it to be a sexual assault, you need that unwanted, non-consensual, sexualized touch. What that means for me is different than what it means for anyone else in this room. So that's up for the person who receives the touch to decide for themselves. We don't get to decide that for someone else.
So I think understanding that it's their decision and that they're the expert on their own body is really important because it helps both believe victims, and I think it also helps get away from the dangerous idea that we need a specific set of actions or behaviors or like a kind of a code that defines what this looks like, because I think that can be very limiting in scope and kind of delegitimize some of the experiences these survivors have. So that basically just helps me keep in mind that it's important to believe people when they say they've been violated in some kind of way, just because that experience is very real to them and it's only them who can decide when that is happening. The final educational aspect that I wanted to talk about from the sexual violence presentation was that it is very much, sexual violence is about an expression of power. It's the ability for someone to have power over someone else and put them in a situation where they feel coerced or forced into some kind of sexual interaction that they don't want to be a part of. And Bailey made the very astute, point that whenever there's some kind of power dynamic involved in the society we live in, unfortunately, race and gender and neo-colonial types of structures still play a large role in these types of power dynamics.
People are coming to university and they have expectations because of pop culture about what it's going to be like. And we can't really do anything with, okay, we've got our policy on sexual violence, that's great, policies are great. Policies don't mean anything if the culture upholds the behavior. So when we talk about rape culture, the first thing that we have to remember is that racism and colonialism are protective factors. So white men who cause harm are treated differently than black men who cause harm.
And that's no exception when it interacts with rape culture. So necessarily when we're thinking about these things, we have to realize that people are going to interact with the types of policies we have very differently based off those experiences. Like, for example, Indigenous women are much more likely to be targeted just because they have, less access to the types of systems and repercussions that protect other types of women, and things like that. So just keeping in mind and being cognizant of those experiences, obviously it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a good first step into understanding the barriers different people might face to feeling safe in society and then accessing necessary resources should they experience sexual violence. After discussing the kind of different aspects and expressions of sexual violence as well as how it is experienced by different people, we finished out the presentation by talking about what our role as residence fellows is relative to sexual violence. So there were two big takeaways. The first one was not to give advice.
Please explore the options with them. As you said, survivors are the experts of their own lives. They may say to you, because they're young and this is the first time out of home and you are the person that makes the most sense to them in that moment, they may say to you, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Please don't answer that question. You don't know. You're not in their shoes. So just make sure that you tell them, well, I can't make that call for you, but let me tell you what you can do and you can decide. And you don't have to decide today.
It's a situation in which someone has been stripped of a great deal of power. So stepping in and telling them this is what the process is going to look like, you now have to do these various things, is actually exacerbating the problem. So I think understanding that's really important, and the name of the game is offering them resources, but trying as much as possible to restore that agency. And then factoring in the other part of the conversation about race and gender and whatnot, we have to be mindful of that when we are talking about resources and things like that.
So this is the hardest part. Dismantling this is going to be the challenge. We have our policy. We can write policies all day. This is the hard work. But you have an opportunity as leaders on campus and as leaders in a community to be the ones that can challenge these kinds of things.
We have to start in whatever way possible to start to challenge and break down these barriers, so hopefully everyone can move towards a world where there is one day hopefully not sexual violence, and in the meantime has more equitable access to resources that would protect people from it and then help them recover from sexual violence incidents when necessary. So in conclusion, I walked away with a better understanding of sexual violence, what it looks like, how it manifests, the types of impacts intersectionality has on it, and it was open to good discussion about how to approach it in such a way that restores people's agency rather than forces a solution onto them. Moving on to item number 2. One of my other favorite presentations from August training was the community conduct presentation. And frankly, not too much of it was that new because it's very much a part of the RF job, but I think it's a great opportunity now to talk about the way Carleton does conduct, because I think it's really useful, and I think it would be something I would like to see at more institutions, and what I took away from it. So Carleton does conduct in a impact-based way, insofar as they use what's called rights and responsibilities. So while there are a couple of actual hard and fast rules, the majority of these rules aren't written as a letter of the law kind of thing, where it's like you may not do this, you have to be quiet after 11 o'clock. They do things like you have a right to live in a space that has reasonable quiet. You have a responsibility to uphold reasonable quiet during all hours. So that's basically the framework for the types of conversations we have.
Agency and control, right? We're not just telling you what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do. This is your sandbox to play in, and these are the expectations we have of you.
The benefits of this policy are many, but I think the first big one is that it helps to build positive relationships between residents, fellows, and students, and between students and students, because it's a conversation about how it impacts the community rather than based off of you have to do this because the rules say so. And I've enjoyed being able to do that as a residence fellow because I much prefer having conversations about why things are done. For example, I've had to deal with beer pong, which we don't allow in residence. But instead of saying, oh, you can't play beer pong here because it is against the rules or because the institution says so, it opens the conversation about we are afraid that it's going to encourage binge drinking, which can have a negative impact on the students around you, many of whom are trying alcohol for the first time, which I think gives them a much better understanding of why we care. And is just much less of an aggressive conversation to have, and kind of makes them realize that we're thinking about them rather than just thinking about the job or upholding the rules just because that's the way they are. And then I think it also opens opportunities for students to have similar conversations between themselves about the types of communities they want to live in.
I think it also helps when you have that student that's mad that someone is having friends and having a conversation in their room at 4 p.m. because they want to nap at 4. That student has a right to make a reasonable amount of noise. So you can have those discussions that aren't just based on, you can't be too noisy. Well, they have rights too, and you need to learn how to coexist with other people's rights.
And then I'm hoping it'll create a generation of students who leave residence thinking about not, just kind of doing the math in their head of if I have 3 strikes, I can do this much, get away with this much. People will leave thinking about, okay, if I want to live my life a certain way, how is that going to impact the people around me? And I think I hope that I've been able to impart that on some of the students I've interacted with, and it's an attitude that I hope to foster in my own behavior. All right. The final training session I want to talk about is the one on ASLR, or it is our general strategy for approaching students and engaging with them for everything from roommate conflicts to mental health crises, just across the map, how to approach someone who probably needs your help but may or may not be reluctant to volunteer that information or engage in that conversation. So I'm just going to do this one off the top of my head because it comes up a lot. So here we go. So they break this into 4 steps, ASLR. So the A of ASLR is approach. It means finding a good way to approach that student, so maybe knocking on the door, and they encourage us to be very direct. So, if you're worried about them, rather than just asking vague questions like, how's life, or how are things going, and kind of just throwing an eyebrow, that's very easy for people to deflect and just be like, oh, I'm great, and then they close the door, and then there you are. Approaching is about saying hey, I noticed you were not at the caf, or hey, I've noticed you haven't been yourself. Are you all right? And that's a much more direct question that they can, and maybe they are fine, and they can just be like, no, I'm doing great. I was, I was under the weather. But it offers them the opportunity to, come forward with that information. It offers them that opportunity to access you as a resource. And even if they decline it, then they know, okay, Graham's looking out for me. I can always approach him. The second step is the S, or support. And that just means reiterating that you're there for them, offering to listen, and just kind of like generally kind of being there for them in a positive way. That's a pretty quick step, but it's important to kind of, use the right language and the, body language, proper listening techniques to make that happen. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there, but that leads right into the L, which is listening, which seems kind of intuitive, but it can often be quite difficult. Listening obviously means using good body language. It means, making eye contact. It means, repeating and paraphrasing what they're saying. All of those good techniques. But it's also just important to remember to do it in general, because it's very easy to, when someone confides in you, to want to immediately offer advice. Like if someone says, oh, I'm struggling with, whatever, anxiety, I'm struggling with school. It's very easy to want to jump in and immediately be like, oh, this is what I do, this is what you should do as well. Which can be very off-putting, and you might end up missing the point of that, because they might, the next thing out of their mouth might have been something completely different. So just listening, walking them through that, asking questions that can kind of get the whole story is very important. Making them feel heard can go a long way, and sometimes all that they want to do is just tell you. They have it under control. They know that they need to exercise or go to this past workshop, but just telling you out loud is fantastic. And then the final step is the R, which means refer. So refer, it just relates to our job as Res Fellows is often connecting people with resources, which I think is also just a useful thing to know how to do in general, just because very few people are qualified psychiatrists, and it's important to know your limits. So sometimes we can help students out. Like sometimes we can be like, they might have a question like, where is the vacuum, or like how did you deal with homesickness? But very often it's the case that there are resources that would be best suited to help them, and that's important to keep in mind. And it doesn't mean it's a failure on your part. It just means that there is someone else who's most qualified to help them. So the refer just is recommending resources. It's not forcing it on anyone, but it's saying, okay, these are the things you have at your disposal. You can access them as you need to. So that wraps up my August training video, but I'll see you in the next one. So that wraps up my August training video. Hopefully it comes out engaging and interesting. Yeah. I'm gonna try it again. See you in the next one. See you in the next one. I really thought about how to close this out.